Welcome to beautiful Barcelona, Spain 2026. A race so thrilling that the most exciting thing to happen all weekend actually happened in Monaco. That's not a great start. Still, we did get questionable strategy, questionable stewarding, questionable reliability, and a McLando setup experiment that appears to have accidentally discovered how to turn a fast car into a medium car. So that's something, I suppose. Everything in this video is based on publicly available team radios, FIA documents, timing data, interviews, and Papaya Koala's increasingly concerning collection of screenshots. Any opinions expressed are exactly that, opinions, even when they happen to be correct. And if you're wondering whether Snake Stallard is a real person, no. Real snakes are usually better strategists. Welcome back to Formula Britain, the Spanish edition, where the racing is closer than ever, provided you ignore the timing screens, the telemetry, the cars, and your own eyes. Closer racing? Haha, no. This is officially the least close racing of the current decade. Again, only 5 cars finished on the lead lap. At this point, the cars aren't racing each other. They're simply traveling to the same destination at vastly different speeds. But before we even get to Spain, we need to talk about Monaco. Because somehow the biggest story of the Spanish Grand Prix happened 1,000 kilometers away. Pierre Fox had his Monaco pit lane speeding penalty overturned and his podium restored. Good news for Pierre. Absolute chaos for literally everybody else. Isaac lost his trophy and points. Oscar got nothing and lost points. George got nothing. Every driver who actually served one of those now proven totally incorrect penalties got left holding the bag. Oscar in particular was absolutely hammered because he didn't just receive the 5-second penalty. He pitted a second time specifically only to serve it. Without that penalty, doesn't need or make that stop, meaning the incorrect penalty effectively became a stop-go plus 5 seconds. Then add yet another slow McLando pit stop for Oscar because apparently Oscar's crew still believe tire changes should be treated as a relaxing group activity. In total, he lost roughly 28 seconds. And if you return those 28 seconds, based purely on race times, Oscar actually wins Monaco. Not finishes second, not gets a podium. Wins. Meanwhile, George would likely have remained in the points instead of being completely wrecked by the double penalty circus. Then you've got the drivers who were warned how to avoid the pit lane issue after others had already been penalized, which created a lasting advantage. At this point, Monaco has become such a regulatory disaster that the only genuinely fair solution would be to nullify the entire race. Of course that won't happen. Because nobody important was inconvenienced. Because Emperor Toto and Darth Confidence Kimi emerged from the chaos looking rather good. And nullifying Monaco would wipe out some very useful youngest ever records. Can't have that, not when liberality is trying to replace actual racing with manufactured records. Meanwhile, it turns out that despite Fat Rat's absolute certainty at the time, Oscar apparently wasn't speeding at all. Meaning if McLando had bothered to appeal instead of immediately throwing him under the nearest bus, Oscar may never have served the penalty, and may well have won the race. Funny how these things always seem to work out in one particular direction, Lando's. But enough about Monaco. Let's get to Spain. FP2. Oscar is happy with the car. He finishes just 3 thousandths behind Lando. 3 thousandths. Naturally, this cannot be allowed. Clearly a crisis requiring immediate intervention. So overnight, the setup gets changed. By FP3, the issue has been successfully resolved. Oscar is now 0.3 slower than Lando. Outstanding efficiency. Elsewhere, Kimi Confidence is having a difficult morning. First, he's upset about traffic. Then he's upset about more traffic. Then he's upset about a driver who literally drove off the circuit to get out of his way. At one point, he asks,
"Why do I always get the traffic? Everyone is always in the way!"
Even the Sheep team admit that he doesn't actually get more traffic than any other drivers, but his inability to cope with it screams of entitlement. At this point, I'm beginning to suspect Kimi believes all 20 cars should complete their laps on a roster system specifically designed around his convenience. Bono responds with the patience of a man explaining gravity to a toddler. Unfortunately, I don't release those cars out of their garages. Translation: Mate, I'm good, but I'm not controlling every car in Spain. Kimi's response? Kimi reacts by swerving erratically and brake-checking Lance. In previous eras, that sort of thing usually earned grid penalties and penalty points. Kimi receives a reprimand. Just a gentle, please don't do that again. See, this is why so many people think Kimi is spotless. Not because he never does anything wrong, but because whenever he does, it somehow evaporates before reaching the penalty sheet. Confidence is apparently aerodynamic. George, meanwhile, tops FP3. The Sheep commentary team immediately explain that he will carry this
confidence
into qualifying. Of course, not speed, not setup, not talent.
confidence.
Everything is confidence now. By next week, they'll be measuring it in litres. Barcelona qualifying gave us a little bit of everything. Hope, confusion, suspicion, and yet another reminder that Formula One increasingly resembles a reality television show with occasional racing attached. First, hometown hero Alonso exits in Q1, a genuinely sad moment. Alonso had hinted this could be his last Barcelona appearance, and while Papaya Koala hopes that doesn't mean his last Spanish race entirely, it did feel like the end of an era. Because love him, which we do, or hate him, mainly bitter Lewis fans, Alonso's a real racer. And like Max, he's made it pretty clear these Franken-cars aren't exactly his idea of a good time. Then came George. Pole position, which was unexpected. Apparently George stole Kimi's confidence.
No! That's the wrong arrow!
Again. The Librarity script department must have been furious. The Sheep team immediately began explaining how George carried his confidence from FP3 into qualifying, then how he would carry it into the race. Somewhere in the Arrow garage, Kimi's confidence appears to have gone missing. Police are investigating. Lewis puts the Ferrari on the front row. Kimi takes P3, Lando P4, Max P5, young Isaac P6, and Oscar, sadly P7. A genuinely miserable qualifying session. The car looked wrong. The balance looked wrong. And as we later discovered, it actually was wrong. Funny how Oscar always seems to get the experimental setup. Never Lando. Always Oscar. What remarkable luck. Poor Charles, meanwhile, crashes at the start of Q3. Ferrari fans immediately entered the 5 stages of grief. Most of them skipped straight to conspiracy. And this is where Papaya Koala starts hearing the X-Files theme. Because once again, a Lewis teammate suddenly starts having unusual weekends right around the moment they become a genuine threat to Lewis. Ferraro might want to have a very careful look around Charles' side of the garage. Because some of us have been around Formula One long enough to remember a few interesting coincidences. Or is that patterns? You remember Spa 2024? The race where George was disqualified because the car was underweight after fuel wasn't properly accounted for. An error that was officially explained away as a simple mistake. Just one tiny problem. These cars are measured, weighed, calculated, and checked so obsessively that forgetting something that fundamental feels a bit like a bank accidentally forgetting to count the money. Possible? Sure. Likely? Well, let's just say people raised an eyebrow, then another eyebrow, then borrowed somebody else's eyebrow. What makes it more interesting is that similar stories seem to follow certain garages around Formula One. There were rumors and accusations by Alonso during the Lewis McLando years. Then there's the Nico Lewis Arrow years that led to Toto swapping the drivers' garages in an attempt to make it stop. Then George starts becoming a genuine threat and suddenly finds himself starring in his own episode of Unfortunate Events, the Formula One edition. Now Charles seems to be experiencing an unusually high concentration of weird luck, mysterious problems, and garage gremlins. Coincidence? Maybe. Formula One has always produced plenty of coincidences. But after a while, even the most optimistic fan starts looking around and wondering if these gremlins are traveling business class. If Ferraro suddenly discovers a former Arrow employee hiding behind a stack of tires with a clipboard labeled totally normal coincidence, then honestly, Papaya Koala won't even be surprised anymore. At this stage, the only thing missing is Scooby-Doo pulling the mask off the culprit and revealing that the mysterious garage gremlin was actually old man narrative all along. And I would have gotten away with it too, if it wasn't for those meddling telemetry engineers. Lights out. And then, well, not much happens. Which honestly sums up quite a lot of 2026 so far. For those new to Formula One, Barcelona is a fascinating circuit. You spend 60 laps waiting for strategy to happen. Then strategy happens, and you wish it hadn't. Off the line, Isaac gets a poor launch. Oscar immediately picks up a position. And then everybody settles into what can best be described as organized queuing. Due to the dreadful setup on Oscar's car, he simply couldn't defend against Charles. Charles drives around him with relative ease. Oscar barely fights it. Not because he doesn't want to, because the car won't let him. Meanwhile, Lando begins his traditional race day hobby, complaining. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just constantly, like a slightly disappointed smoke alarm. Eventually, the team pit him. The race continues. Pit cycles happen. Virtual safety cars happen. The audience remains awake largely through force of will. At one stage, Will notices something rather interesting. Kimi has gone off track, repeatedly, enough times that McLando actually reminds the stewards that they have a job to do. Quite clear Kimi has been off track more than 3 times. Quite clear. To McLando, to viewers, to timing data, to literally everyone, except apparently the stewards. Nothing happens. Nothing gets mentioned. Nothing gets investigated. At least not while it could actually affect the race. It's becoming a familiar pattern. Kimi's mistakes seem to exist in a strange quantum state, visible to everyone, yet simultaneously invisible, because it's difficult to sell a generational talent narrative if viewers keep noticing all the errors, and even harder if he is correctly penalized for those errors. And unfortunately for Formula One, people have eyes, and they are starting to notice.
Since switching to Kimi Antonelli undies, my confidence has never been higher. No matter how much mess I create, I know nothing is sticking today. That's confidence.
George versus Kimi. This was actually interesting, which naturally meant it couldn't last. George was holding Kimi back despite being on the worst strategy. Kimi wanted to be waved through. Lando was hovering behind, unable to catch up or pass because of, yep, you guessed it, dirty air. Again, Will starts getting nervous. Lando radios, I can either go or I can drop back and it's gone. I can't do both. Translation? I really cannot cope with dirty air and I can't pass on track unless my car is massively faster. Eventually, George appears to move aside. It looked a lot like a team-ordered courtesy pass. Kimi gets through. The sheep team celebrate.
Here comes History Boy!
The narrative survives. And then Kimi's engine explodes. Race over in a puff of karma-colored smoke. Shortly afterwards, Charles also retires with hydraulic issues. The Ferraro giveth. The Ferraro taketh away. And not just Ferraro, because retirements continue to be an F1 standard. By the end of the afternoon, 7 cars have retired. Yes, 7. For the second race in a row. Modern Formula One is supposed to be the pinnacle of reliability. Apparently, nobody informed the cars. At one point, the race begins to resemble a survival challenge. The winner may simply be whoever remains operational. We haven't seen reliability this poor in decades. Also, only 5 cars finished on the lead lap. 5. So when Formula One tells us the racing is closer than ever, I'm not entirely sure that's true. Unless they're measuring how closely parked together the broken cars are in the paddock. Now then, let's discuss everyone's favorite segment, Snake's strategy shenanigans. Oscar's radio was fascinating because he increasingly sounded like a man who knew exactly what was coming and knew nobody was going to listen. Charles fakes a pit stop. An old trick. Nothing special, except Snake falls for it completely.
Box to cover Charles.
Then Charles doesn't pit. At all. Normal teams might reassess. Snake instead screams,
Box, 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 box!
sounding like a man trying to stop a toddler running into traffic. Oscar responds with perhaps the most Oscar response imaginable.
Copy. Box.
Not angry, not emotional, just spiritually exhausted. Snake has been successfully out-strategized by a driver who wasn't even trying. At this point, it would honestly be easier if Ferraro simply sent McLando a calendar invitation titled, Fake Pit Stop, Please Overreact. McLando accidentally produced the fastest stop of the race, a clear operational error which I'm sure they'll investigate internally. Later, Snake continues insisting the pace is good. The times are good. Everything is good. All while telling Oscar that he's 3/10 slower than Lando, which raises an obvious question. If you're slower, what exactly is good about his times? Good for who? Certainly not Oscar. Oscar begins questioning the strategy, a dangerous development. because Oscar's track record of being right is becoming increasingly inconvenient for the strategy department. Then comes the moment that perfectly sums up the entire Oscar-McLando relationship.
I think this is still plan A, Oscar.
I think this plan is terrible, but if you think that's better, then that's okay with me. There it is. Their entire relationship. Oscar says the strategy is bad. The team ignores him. The strategy turns out to be bad. Everybody acts surprised. At this point, Oscar's strategy calls have a better success rate than the actual strategists. Yet somehow he's still the only person whose opinion doesn't matter. Remarkable. Heading into race day, the expectations are simple. McLando should be fast. Arrows will be faster. Ferrari will probably find a way to make things difficult for themselves. And Lewis should complain about something. Some traditions are important. Strangely, the only tradition followed in Spain 2026 was Lewis complaining. Every race features at least one Lewis radio message suggesting the car is moments away from complete structural collapse. Sometimes he wins. Sometimes he doesn't. But the complaints remain consistent. This week, however, something unusual happens. Ferraro's strategy actually works. I know. I was shocked too. Scientists are currently studying the phenomenon. Write it down! Frame it! Celebrate it! Because it actually happened. Conversely, George's strategy was awful. Kimi leaves with slightly less confidence than he arrived with. Oscar's strategy was typically papaya-flavored to disadvantage Oscar. But Ferraro absolutely nailed Lewis' strategy, and for the first time in years, Lewis wins. Lewis stole Kimi's confidence with the help of a functional and fast Ferraro and, actually effective strategy. The Tifosi celebrate. Genuinely well managed. Congratulations, Lewis legend. Even if the entire weekend looked like he was losing an argument with his hairdresser. George hangs on to second. Lando takes third, Max P4. Oscar finishes fifth. And both Mini Bulls and Alpaz also finish in the points. Oscar's post-race assessment? Snake says, not our fastest afternoon, but fifth is a decent result. Oscar responds,
That was quite the experience.
peak Oscar. Most drivers would write a novel. Oscar delivers a single sentence and somehow sounds more annoyed than everyone else combined, which in Oscar speak is roughly equivalent to, what in the absolute hell was that? And honestly, fair question. Of course, immediately the sheep media begin pretending Oscar was the problem. Rosie Sheep even says Oscar's market value has taken a plunge as a result of his recent poor form, because naturally, couldn't possibly be the setup, couldn't possibly be the strategy, couldn't possibly be the fact the car was outside its operating window. No, must be Oscar. Conveniently forgetting that after the race McLando themselves admitted the setup experiment had gone badly wrong. Apparently, Oscar's car had wildly different differential, suspension and anti-roll bar settings. The configuration pushed the car outside its optimal operating window. Made it unpredictable. Made it inconsistent. Made it slower. And a car operating somewhere between competitive Formula One machine and agricultural equipment. Yet somehow only Oscar received this experiment. Again, remarkable luck. Which begs the question, why is Oscar not allowed to choose his own strategy instead of being forced to rely on the whims of his strategically incapable teammate? Why do McLando only allow splitting strategies when it will benefit Lando? Why is Oscar the one who ends up with the experimentally bad setups? The answer to all questions comes back to Fat Rat's poorly disguised love affair with Lando, a situation that Papaya Koala doesn't see ending anytime soon. So once again, Papaya Koala hopes that Oscar's exhausted tone and Alonso-esque why bother attitude is just Oscar managing expectations with damage limitation, and plans for a fresh start with his far more competent engineer Pedro at a less toxic team next year. After the race, Kimi finally picked up penalties. One for the dirty and dangerous erratic driving and FP3 incident. One for track limits being pinged for 4 when there were so clearly more than that. The FP3 incident earned a gentle reprimand. The track limits earned 5 seconds taken off his DNF time. Neither changed anything, which is a bit like being fined after you've already left the country. Technically punishment. Practically irrelevant. Confidence remains undefeated. Then came the sheep team's favourite moment, an all-British podium. And apparently this is fantastic for the sport. Now don't get me wrong, it's fantastic for Britain. But in a global championship, a podium from only one country generally isn't viewed as healthy, especially when the rest of the world is already starting to suspect the entire sport is becoming Formula Britain. Not exactly helping the optics, and the sheep media gushing over it only makes it worse. So that was Spain 2026. A race where Formula One once again demonstrated that when the on-track action isn't providing enough drama, the strategy departments are more than willing to step up. Only 5 drivers finished on the lead lap. Again, the racing remains less competitive than before the regulations. The cars remain less reliable than before the regulations. And somehow we're still being told everything is working perfectly. 7 DNFs in consecutive races. Home heroes retiring at home races. Oscar in Australia, Charles in Monaco, Alonso in Spain. Invisible penalties, for Kimi at least. Visible favoritism, for Lando always. Experimental setups that Oscar once again extracted a respectable result from, under circumstances that were considerably less respectable. And enough
Confidence
to power a small city. So what do you reckon, legends? Was Oscar's setup experiment genuinely just bad luck, or part of the long-running pattern of favoritism for Lando? Is Snake once again auditioning for a role in the Sabotage Hall of Fame? And will Kimi steal his confidence back from Lewis in time for the next race? Let me know below. If you've enjoyed this episode, give us a like. If you're new here, subscribe. And if you'd like to help fund future investigations into confidence, experimental setups, and Snake's increasingly creative strategy decisions, consider joining the channel or buying me a coffee. Every coffee helps fund race replays, radio investigations, emergency snake monitoring, and our ongoing search for evidence that Plan A has ever actually worked. Until next time, stay safe, stay skeptical, and remember, if your race engineer says,
This is still Plan A,
you may already be in Plan F. Papaya Koala, out! And then, Kimi's engine explodes. Race over in a puff of karma-colored smoke.